Let's dive into the discussions shaping the nation.
Good morning to Ceann Cordia, and delighted to have this opportunity to speak in terms of support for the revised national planning framework, a revision that I think is very welcome and I think which also acknowledges the changed context for the need for accelerated housing, and I think it's also important to emphasise the equal importance of infrastructural and all the associated deliveries for this country. I think it does represent the step change that we need, and I would hope that in tandem with the commencement and the full commencement of the Planning and Development Act that we will see that step change in delivery. I come at this particular debate with a dual perspective, one now as a member of Dáil Éireann, but also previously, like many other colleagues in the House, as a former county councillor, having gone through the formation of a county development plan, which for anyone that's new to politics is very instructive in how the entire planning process and the planning framework is set up in terms of the various hierarchy of regional and local needs as well. But also, I think also quite instructive for many of us that are frustrated with the pace of delivery of housing, how comprehensive and how significant the overall volume of movement that is required is as well. But I do think in making this revision and accelerating and translating this revision to the local authorities, it does demonstrate the agility that we need to see at all levels of the state in terms of coping with the need for an accelerated provision of housing, but also for thinking of how do we future-proof the developments that we need to put in place. I think it's important also that the Department and the Minister translate that agility and reflect that agility to the local and regional authorities in terms of how they take the direction now from the national planning framework and bring it then to their elected members for translation into local, county and city development plans, and to ensure that there is no gaps and that is treated with a housing first urgency across all authorities in the state. Like many members from both sides of the House, I have been acquainted with decisions that have been made by local authorities in Dublin and outside Dublin that seem to fly in the face of the housing first and the urgency for housing delivery that we hear about on the airwaves, that we hear about in this House as well, in terms of nearly making it difficult for developers to proceed with minor schemes or smaller schemes because they're not necessarily adhering to every letter of every objective there. And rather than have a can-do attitude from local authorities in engaging with those developers, I think it is important that we listen to those who are at the coalface of development of all sizes, be they small builders or large developers, to ensure that we do get on top of what is possibly one of the most defining social crises of our generation. I want to agree with a lot of what my colleague Deputy Connolly has said with regard to the importance of the National Development Plan in this piece. And I note that in the documents around the National Planning Framework, there's a lot of talk about being aligned with the NDP. I think I would like to see the NDP as being the instrument of the National Planning Framework to enable what we need to happen in this country, where we will have a population of nearly 6.5 million people in a matter of 5, 10, 15 years. We need to ensure that we have the transport infrastructure put in place, and that needs to be the priority for what we do, that we do have that transport-oriented development, and the NDP is seen as an instrument of that delivery. For in my own constituency, delivery of an adequate roads infrastructure for areas like Rathcoole, Saggart, Newcastle, things that are listed in the South Dublin County Development Plan, like the Western Dublin Orbital Route, need to be now advanced. They need to be put in place to enable the housing delivery that will happen in that part of Dublin over the next 5-10 years, and which has happened already because we are playing catch-up too. Things like the Lewis for Lucan, which we know is in the Greater Dublin Transport Strategy, but we need to have an urgency injected under that to ensure that it does enable further development in Lucan, but also provides adequate public transport infrastructure for areas that will remain in high demand. It's not as if people are not going to want to live in these areas in 40, 50, 60 years' time. Ultimately, the aim of the NPF should be to build up large cities that are hubs for their economic regions and that replace the population, and where there isn't kind of just an ageing population left there, but they remain attractive to families over time, and that the facilities that underpin them are done in that same way as well. I'm particularly keen that the National Planning Framework will be taken on board by the Department of Education and their school building section. Sometimes I don't know if other colleagues feel the same, but I feel there's a frustration in terms of the speed with which the school building section, for example, in the Department of Education acknowledges and looks at the demographic projections that are in place for a particular area, or if the school planning areas are necessarily aligned with what is set out by the National Planning Framework or county development plans or city county development plans as well. I think it's important for that match to happen, and that comes back to the point I made earlier on about the importance for a housing first culture in terms of how we think of and how we implement the national planning framework. Also, With regard to things like childcare, and in the questions to the Minister for Children last night, a number of deputies discussed the need to ensure that where provision is being made in development for the provision of childcare facilities, that they are actually translating into childcare facilities. And we know there's a patchy record of that across the country at the moment. Also with regard to services like Garda Station, Garda numbers as well. I would, as I conclude, I would encourage the Department and the local authorities to engage with bodies at all levels of delivery, whether they be national state agencies like Uisce Éireann or ESB networks, and also the small developers, to ensure that the urgency that we require to deal with this crisis is being reflected across the country, and also to look abroad. For example, some of the reforms that are being pursued in New Zealand with regard to the easing of zoning rules. Are they things that we should look at in this country as well, in order to get the supply of housing up to the 50,000 a year that we're not just going to need for the next 3 or 4 years, but ideally for the next 10 to 15.
Thank you, Deputy. We move now.
Like, share, and subscribe, and let us know your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear from you.